Hi folks, Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy Mba to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy Mba is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Esteban, welcome to Next Economy Now.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you. I'd love to just invite you to share some of your background with our listeners. What's the work you're up to, and how did you get here? What's your life journey, and how did it bring you to this moment?
In one sentence or less, right?
Yeah, keep it really short.
So, I mean, I think you're right. It really is a life journey. Like what I'm up to now is completely tied to my life's journey, and I feel like I'm just at this really interesting place where there's a lot of momentum around a lot of things that I've been working on or visioning or organizing in collaboration with a lot of buddies of mine over so many years. That's really looking toward, pushing us to get in a right relationship with each other as people, with the planet, with ourselves. And so much of that has to do with building a just, sustainable economy, a solidarity economy where we're practicing those things. Building up the kinds of mechanisms culturally, the skills that allow us to do that around communication, facilitation, humility, healthy conflict, and building up structures that enable us to transform the fundamentals of our economy. So that sounds really abstract and vague. So what I'm up to these days, I have 2 jobs and then a couple voluntary things that fit into that scope in different ways. For about 4 years now, I've been the executive director for the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. And I was actually at the founding conference for the USFWC back in 2004. So
I remember that conference.
Yeah, that's going on 15 years now.
I know. I sent a worker owner to that conference.
Yeah. And I think that there are only 2 of us. Melissa Hoover, the founding executive director, and myself are, I believe, the only people who've been to every national worker co-op conference, including the founding one. And I was a board member there back while I was a worker owner at a food co-op in West Philly, which is where I live and organize, called Mariposa Food Co-op. So that was probably like, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years ago that I joined the board. And concurrent with that, I started a worker co-op in 2010 called AORTA, which stands for Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance. And we initially formed it as a kind of this like loose collaboration for a bunch of freelancers who were organizing as independent contractors, as facilitators, conflict mediators, consultants, trainers, using participatory methodologies for clients, movements, campaigns, but also bringing a shared framework around intersectional movements for collective liberation for all the work we were doing. And over the course of, I think, especially our first year and a half of being together, half of us slowly convinced the other half of us that our vision really was pointing toward us becoming a worker cooperative. And so we finally incorporated as one back in 2014 and have been growing. I don't know if it would be steadily or rapidly since then, but we're now about almost triple what we were when we first started. There's, I think we're up to 13 of us as either worker owners or candidates for worker ownership.
Oh, very cool.
And then there's a bunch of folks we collaborate with regularly. And then I'm in my second term as an appointee by the mayor of Philadelphia to our Food Policy Advisory Council. I spent the last year and a half chairing that, and I just finally stepped back from that leadership role, just because there wasn't time for all of that. But I'm still active in that council, and that's working on sort of everything throughout the steps of the food system, from urban agriculture, dealing with food insecurity and hunger, healthy food procurement, workforce and economic development, all kinds of stuff. That's the latest. And actually, I co-founded one of our subcommittees that's working on zero waste and coming up with a vision and some plans and infrastructure within the greater Philadelphia area around everything from composting, recycling, all that stuff. So all the different aspects of the food system. And I've been part of a racial equity initiative within that Food Policy Council around shifting what that work looks like and what the impact is here in our majority POC city. And then the last thing I think I'll mention up top is just because it started coming up recently and a lot of people either never knew or just forgot that this was part of my work and organizing is in 2004, end of 2004, I joined a collective and was part of the reboot of a collective called Philly Stands Up, which works on initially restorative justice, and pretty quickly we learned about transformative justice and got involved as that framework was really taking shape, just as a paradigm even. So we work on transformative justice processes that support survivors of sexual assault by working directly with the people who've caused harm in either sexualized violence or intimate partner violence situations. And so over the last, we really spent like 10 years really actively doing that work. And we've all sort of stepped back from that, and we've played more of a educational role, sharing about our experience with that and sharing frameworks and philosophy and training other people in how to embed these practices in their communities in a completely grassroots way, from a prison abolitionist standpoint that does not engage the criminal legal system or the police in any way. And so, yeah, it's both of those pieces. We both were just at a very grassroots level, sitting down, 2 by 2, with people who've caused harm and helping them over the course of, in a lot of cases, 1 to 3 years for each situation through their transformation and coming to terms with the impact of their actions, or even understanding that, and then also popularizing some of those tools and methodologies.
Wow. Okay, so that's your one sentence.
It was a run-on sentence, but that counts, right?
I knew it was going to be dense, Esteban, but wow. Where are you from?
I'm originally from New York. I grew up in the suburbs of New York City on Long Island. My family is from Jamaica, and I was...
Jamaica Queens or Jamaica?
You know what? Actually, my family's from the Caribbean, yeah. So half of my generation was born, actually 3/4 of my generation was born back in the old country on the island of Jamaica. Yeah. And starting with my older sister was actually born down there, and it was only my older brother and I were the first ones born in this country in my family, and my younger sister, of course. And that was the end of that generation. And all my second cousins, the next generation below, were born here. So my family's part of this, sort of third world diaspora dynamic. And my parents met in New York, so they weren't connected back in Jamaica. And so that further exacerbates the diaspora a little bit. On my mom's side, they're like in the UK and like all over the world. And on my dad's side, we're very much hubbed in New York. And to this day, most of my family is in the greater New York area, with just a couple exceptions.
And you're in Philly, not too far away.
I'm in Philly, and it sounds like I just sort of like hopped on a Chinatown bus to get here, but actually I had this long circuitous route, left New York about 20 years ago and went to the West Coast. I was in the Bay Area for about 5 years. Spent some time in Brazil, and actually when I left California, I moved to the Midwest. I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan for about a year and a half, and then from there, I finally made my way back to the East Coast. I've been in West Philly for about 15, coming up on 15 years, not quite 14 years now.
Esteban, yeah, you know, I've been looking forward to speaking for a while, and I guess it feels like your work is so timely, right? These solutions, strategies, tactics, everything you've been practicing and building for your career strikes me as it's not maybe completely, but large part is a huge part of the solution sets that we need for the problems that are really bubbling up right now. So I guess I just wanted to invite you to comment on like the state of the world in this moment, and on a personal note, like, what are you feeling? Like, what's coming up for you now? Are you like, finally, I told you the whole time I've been working on it, or?
Actually, yes, that's exactly how I feel. And it's funny. I feel sort of split. Like I have both intellectually and at a heart level, I have this paradoxical pull in two different directions. That part of me feels like, man, I threw my hand on this climate stuff 10 years ago because I marched into UN conferences of the parties, back in 2000, and nobody listened, and it didn't matter, and the system didn't care, and blah, blah, blah. And it before Al Gore's documentary even. And so it's funny to see this stuff mainstreamed, to see even just phenomenons of greenwashing coming out of organizing in the 90s, where we were like beating our heads against the wall to just be like, yo, can we do some basic stuff around sustainability, consumption, reduction of that, integration of systems where we're reusing and recycling things, using thinking more intentionally about how we're sourcing materials, all of that stuff, which was like, I mean, we were just like laughed out of every conversation other than speaking to radical people and like witches or something, basically indigenous people were like, yeah, similarly, they're like, we've been telling you this for literally hundreds of years. And so finally there's some like Western people who are like awakening to this. And now it's sort of cyclical. Now a lot of those more progressive, radical, grassroots movements and organizers are like, oh, now we get why you were frustrated around our sort of like nascent and naive attempts of pushing this forward. And yet the same way that we needed to slow down and connect with that wisdom from indigenous and other communities of color organizing, we're learning what it looks like to slow down to the pace and absorb the advice and the guidance of people who have been paying attention for longer, and feeling on the other side of that, like, this is so great that people are waking up to this reality, and what are those inroads for being able to strategize together? And in fact, it's sort of going the other direction, which is this pull toward catastrophizing, toward the apocalyptic, and a media narrative about hopelessness and nihilism, especially around climate apocalypse, that really does need to be reined in, because it's the takeaway from that framing is still, it's still, we can't make a difference. There's no concrete action or set of things we could do. There isn't a political will because it's so overwhelming anyway. We may as well just stay the course. And it's like,
watch your television.
Yeah, it's like being on the express train that just goes right past your stop, and you're like, no, we were heading in the right direction, and now we've flown right past it. So this is the New York stuff is coming up now.
Right.
Metaphors. It will all come back to the MTA.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that there is something there around, like, there are some real practical moves. And I think for me, even the shift has been understanding, I don't want to just say rhetorically, but in terms of a political commitment and a values sense, like, because I sort of live in the future, like if you want to know the things we should be engaging with or what's coming down the pike in 50 years, like, that's what I'm thinking about now. And so, like, in the 90s, the stuff I was thinking about is like now headline stuff that's talking about 30 years from now. And I was like, yeah, that's what we need to be gearing up for. And so I think then I was still involved in movements where a lot of the framing was, please pay attention to this issue. It matters. And pleading for validation. And even just like a nod or some affirmation or agreement that like, yes, this is a problem. I don't know. And that's obviously painting a broad brush. We had a lot of concrete demands and proposals around things. But I don't know that we had as much really pragmatic material, like in a Marxist sense, like material, actual, mechanisms for what it is that we thought we should do in terms of like transitioning our economy, transitioning the way that governments at a local, regional, federal, international level even functioned, incorporating ways that past harm, trauma, and exploitation were part and parcel of the same steps required toward getting us out of the problem, right? And I think that now I at least feel a lot more wizened and mature about it. And it's interesting to hear people begin to run around flailing like, oh my God, we got to do something. What's our next economy going to be? What's the new economy? What, and it's like, okay, we have some ideas. We have some steps. We have some, right? So for example, with the climate stuff, it's not just, is this coming? What's the science to prove it? How bad will it be? And I think that there's way too much oxygen sucked up by that conversation. And it's more like, y'all, how are we preparing for a public, socialized housing process to absorb the refugees, millions of which from places like Florida and the Gulf Coast that are going to be displaced? We know this as a fact. And we can't just spend all of our time running around and being like, hey, elect better governors in Florida. This is going to be a problem. We actually need more momentum. We need more political power for people listening to our proposals about, let's start building that housing now. Let's start creating those voucher or public or socialized housing programs now, because we know that that's going to happen. And that's even just thinking internally, let alone the international displacement and refugee issues we'll be dealing with for the next 100 years. But so that's the kind of thing that I mean. It's sort of, it's shifting from this sort of like young adult science fiction way of thinking about the problems, right, to thinking in a more like nerdy but pragmatic movement oriented way about like some pretty tactical ways of moving forward.
So are you getting a clearer sense compared to maybe your younger, more idealistic, kind of early 20s, I could see the future, but like now do you have a better idea of like what you're going to get done in your career?
Wow. Yes.
And I won't hold you to it because the future is uncertain and I don't.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was with you right till the end. I think the thing that tripped me up was thinking about it in terms of my career and my personal
your
accomplishments. Right. And I just think I don't necessarily think that way. And if I did, maybe I would have like one job. But I see my role as just being in more a position of facilitating the emergent movements that will bring about that change. And sometimes that's policies and campaigns, and sometimes that's building up skills and potentiality within communities or capacities in individual leaders. Sometimes that's experimenting and just rooting down and, spending 8 years in a particular worker cooperative that has a particular niche or theory of change. And I've now spent 8 years in 2 different worker cooperatives that are working on completely different aspects of this. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I see it more as this like indirect thing about what's my role? How do I move toward opportunities and openings? As context is shifting through a constant process of assessing our political moment. So like coming from a place of praxis, right, a fusion of theory and action and reflection, and having that inform what is the next most impactful or graceful or important or strategic step to take. And so for me, that that isn't about a linear projection of like, all right, if I could just get involved in like non-extractive financial lending, then like that's my career and my journey. Which is not to say that that's not an incredibly useful way for other people or even most people to think. I just have spent enough time with myself, the hot mess that is myself, to know that that's not my highest use for my time on this planet. That I do come from this place of like multitasking, multi-skilled, multi-passioned approaches and interests, and so that's allowed me a range as a generalist who has the capabilities to become maybe a dilettante, but maybe a specialist in certain things. And those skills are generally, I mean, I think they're generalizable skills. They're organizing and facilitating skills. And so even when I plug into a particular project or organization or campaign, it's me putting those skills into a very focused and concrete project. And that might have a beginning, middle, or an end, or a particular vision. And I'm happy to share more about what those visions are, but it's why you can sort of trace, it's easier for me to trace in hindsight, like how I have moved from anti-globalization protest movements to the New Economy Coalition, formerly the New Economics Institute, to Transformative Justice collectives, to student and housing organizing and land trusts, to intentional community. Like I've been through a lot of different places and spaces, you know, the landless workers movement in Brazil or public housing movements in South Africa. And it sounds kind of scattered, but there's a coherence to it.
Yeah, you know, there's a theme. Yeah, would you relate to it's like almost more process oriented, and the future is like complex enough so you don't feel the need to, well, I'm going to do this and then I'll do this, but you're more of like a sense and response.
There is an I'm going to do this. It's just that is, it's very adaptive and emergent. So like if you ask me on a day, like what am I working on now and how is that pushing forward that horizon in 5 years, I could tell you that. And then if you ask me 6 months later, I can tell you that shifted vision, right? But it is this idea of this vanishing horizon that is constantly being reorganized and reoriented.
So, and I know you shared a number of things, but like, so what now, right? This moment. So where is that focus or opportunity, or what's inspiring for you at this moment?
One of those things I think is around expanding, even just like popularizing, pushing forward opportunities for economic democracy and structures for economic democracy and awareness of those structures and systems.
And can I just ask you, like, what do you mean by economic democracy? Right, a naive would say, well, we're a democratic country, and so there you go, you have economic democracy. What's the point?
I feel like we're even struggling for like civic and political democracy right now. Like the very concept of enfranchisement has been exploded, and we've never had full enfranchisement in this country. Yeah. Speaking from an American perspective, obviously. And I do some of this like shifting between inside outside perspective as a global citizen. Is that like a really elitist term to say? I could just say as an immigrant or as a revolutionary, but like I'm like, yeah, borders, that's a thing. But someone who's like open to the pluralism of cultures that inform like where I'm coming from and what needs to happen. I'm someone who's critical of the exceptionalism and individualism of the American conversations that don't take into account global lenses and perspectives. So that's why it's important to me to like name when I'm speaking from an American place, as opposed to like the place that I think all organizers should be capable of zooming back in and out to speak from.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
So, but for me, economic democracy, there's so many elements to both the political economy and and economics, right? Economics is about home, the finances that govern our home. It's not just financial, but all the resources. I was starting to say material pieces of our lives, and so everything from the super basics of food, clothing, shelter, community, work that we rely on to reproduce ourselves on a daily basis, on a generational basis, certainly woven together as an economic, as a societal economy. All of those things so far have had very limited openings for participation, voice, ownership, by which I both mean like actual material ownership, like you might own your car, or you might be leasing that car from a company or a bank who actually owns it. So that kind of ownership, but also ownership in a more intangible sense of like feeling a connection and stewardship, maybe is the word I'm looking for. So being able to have stewardship and voice and like hands-on the economic dimension of our lives or agency around those things, that's part of what I mean by economic democracy. And I think the tangible examples make more sense for people when we talk about stuff like more public institutions, like public banks, or participatory budgeting and opportunities to weigh in on those things, more socialized systems. So that does overlap with the political side of our democracy and political economy. But definitely the complete absence from, I'm going to be lazy here and say progressive communities. Maybe that's better than saying the left. Because I partially because I don't actually believe that those are the lines that should be drawn when we think about these frameworks. It's really about the many versus the few, the bottom versus the top, right? And so I think there's a lack of attentiveness toward the private sector from progressive communities, and that's what I'm interested in pushing forward as a political project. Partially because we were bought off, especially in the 80s, through the development of the nonprofit industrial complex, where this sort of carrot was dangled in front of movements who were revolutionary in the 60s and 70s to say, but we'll give you free money to professionalize this and meet these very specific deliverables. And that was very effective in silencing and even shaping movements and shifting them away from revolutionary transformation into
reinforcing the same actual power structure, right?
Yeah. But it kept us busy and it created some jobs and people were on payroll and whatever. I mean, there were reasons for that being an effective tactic as well. And it's meant that, first of all, our critique was the private sector is bad, right? Like I myself was part of that, this sort of like Adbusters generation that instead of saying capitalism is bad, was saying business is bad, enterprise is bad, producing things, consuming things, everything around the whole business and value chain is bad. Marketing is bad.
Right.
And now I think, thank God, there's been this more, I don't think this is particular to like worker co-op people or solidarity economy people, but I think there is a more broad-based awareness that these things are neutral. They're actually not inherently good or evil. But they are powerful, productive, and in a lot of cases necessary in our modern economy. And so how do we actually enter the conversation and shift things in alignment with our values? So that's what economic democracy is sort of making a case for. I think particularly when we talk about not just like this vague idea of watered down social enterprise, but actually community-owned utilities and grocery stores. So if something is going to be private, if you're not going to have a socialized, food depot or a food pantry for people who are food insecure and experiencing food apartheid, okay, so then can we instead envision things that are family owned, mom and pop owned, or community owned, or worker owned? So I think having more opportunities where the very nature of enterprise is democratized because the people who own or manage or participate other than as like shoppers and consumers are part of it. And to your earlier point and framing around like, well, don't we have economic democracy right now in the United States? That's the argument that I think was made 200 years ago during the revolution of investor-owned companies, right? That the very idea of a stock exchange is that this is democratic. You can buy a share, you vote with those shares. Majority shareholders are the ones who overrule everyone else and make that decision. And our whole economy is based on catering to the needs of those shareholders. There's an argument, a very conservative argument, to be made for that being democratic, or I shouldn't say conservative. There's a very elitist argument. Like that's a very one percenter argument. And that's what our economies, yeah. And I think there's a lot of power there. And some of that I think we could tap into the logics and the assumptions and the principles around American or Western or whatever it is, economics. The question then is not should we, ought we abolish enterprise, but more how do we first of all bring more nuance to enterprise and business and understand that like a Fortune 500 company is really different than a small business, and an international or multinational corporation is really different than a local business.
Is that part of what you meant by attentiveness?
Yeah, that we
really
yeah.
into the nuance.
Yeah, and that can't be a conversation that's relegated to academics in an ivory tower who are like nerdy enough to delve into these conversations and engage in polemics and philosophy around this stuff. That needs to be part of movements, and it needs to be part of movements in a way that's accessible to everyday people, right? So again, not just activists and thought leaders and the vanguard in some revolutionary sense, but the everyone, the 99%.
Do we have some wins or some references to point to?
Well, yeah, I mean, so a lot of my work these days has been around cooperative economics. I think the first battle was reclaiming the erasure of long traditions in communities of color, colonized, enslaved, liberated, indigenous communities of cooperative economics that was erased, first through the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and then as kind of an echo of that through a white supremacist culture in the United States coming out of the sort of baby boomer 60s idea that here's this model around cooperatives, mostly consumer-oriented cooperatives, some food and housing cooperatives. And here's this revolutionary thing that we're Columbusing, that we're pretending like we're discovering, mostly out of our own ignorance. And I don't think that there was anything nefarious about like a intentional plot to erase the long traditions of in this country, African American cooperative practice, economic practice. So that was a big battle. And as recently as 10 years ago, a lot of my friends and I who have been organizing in this space for a while were told by leading thinkers and organizers around every form of cooperative economics that Black people don't do co-ops, which first of all invalidates and separates us from all the Black people outside of the US who are doing co-ops. So that's, first of all, it's just like, y'all, have you been to Colombia? Have you been to Brazil? Have you been in the Caribbean? Have you been to so many parts of East Africa, South Africa, West Africa?
The rest of the world, right?
Yeah, the African diaspora in other countries, especially as displaced people. Like all displaced people are practicing cooperative economics. That is a thing. That is a thing we do. Because how else are you responding toward the struggles, right, of being in those kinds of conditions? So
or even present is Muslims in America right now, right? Making sure they all buy homes and taking care of each other, lending money.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's a corner we have turned, that we have debunked and documented and proved this history and awakened in our own communities, meaning communities of color, this spark and inspiration that like, not only is this possible, not only is it like a aha or a duh moment, like this is part of how we get free, but the main reason that maybe we're less conversant in that history is because of a very active silencing through white supremacy culture. No surprise that we have these traditions going back forever and ever and ever, right? And then I think going even deeper in time, under Jim Crow, especially in the first half of the 20th century, active sabotage by the Klan, by white supremacist racists, actively going to Black-owned cooperative businesses and burning them to the ground,
We're talking about
scaring
Black Wall
customers
Street.
and clients away. I'm talking about basically all of the worker cooperatives that everyone from like Ella Baker to Fannie Lou Hamer were involved in organizing were directly attacked and sabotaged. And so there's a very real reason why we were told that like we never even had this history, right? And then it became dangerous for so-called civil rights organizers to mention the economic rights and economic justice and solidarity economy organizing that they were all involved in, from A. Philip Randolph all the way down, that was seen as dangerous during a moment or an opportunity in the 60s of mainstreaming their cause, of shifting political wind, that opened up the possibility for Black people in the United States gaining civil rights. And there was an internal debate within that movement, which was fighting for both civil and economic rights, to say, we need all of this. Who cares if we get access to a restaurant if we can't afford to even eat there, right? And so the faction who won were the ones who said, look, there's an opening now. The deal, the compromise for a Voting Rights Act, for a Civil Rights Act, is this one right now, and it does not include this bigger revolutionary economic rights process or legislation. And they took the deal, for better or for worse. And now here we are 60 years later, trying to build back that momentum and that awareness.
Can you tie that thread into a phrase you mentioned before, collective liberation? Do you see those as connecting?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the idea that nobody's free until all of us are free. That it's not like we can focus on Black liberation or Chicano liberation or disability justice singularly, separate from thinking about gender and separate from thinking about LGBTQI issues, separate from thinking about neocolonialism, settler colonialism, and imperialism, not just American imperialism, but all forms of imperialism and colonialism, misogyny, all of those issues, whether you think about climate or environment, food justice, are actually all tied. And so collective liberation acknowledges that we all have a stake in this, that we all need to be have each other's backs, in part because the systems of oppression that are colluding against us are themselves interconnected. That anytime we have a win around gender justice, women's liberation, support for non-binary or trans people, is a moment where white supremacy will double down and use racism as a justification for continuing to pull people apart and buy off or bribe. Okay, we're going to give women the right to vote, but in order to do that, we're going to keep the boot on the neck of Black people and other communities of color, right? And that's not to say that it's always oppositional and external. I mean this in terms of the intimate spaces of our everyday lives and relationships, and even our own brains and selves and psyches, right? Like Frantz Fanon talks about this in his work. He was a revolutionary psychoanalyst. I mean, literally fought in the French-Algerian War as a revolutionary, and thought about the ways in which colonialism gets inside the mind of the colonized. And it's overly simplistic to just say, well, the enemy is out there. It's like we have work to do inside of our own minds. And so recognizing that even internal to the homes and relationships of communities of color, we need to address things like intimate partner violence, because that's one of the ways in which people who experience a lack of agency and patterns of violence then go and inflict further harm and violence onto people who are closest to them, which might be their own children or nieces and nephews or spouses. So it's not to say that like the enemy is just Jeff Sessions or something, right? That like the work we have to do around collective liberation is multifaceted. It's a project of exposing ourselves to the surface area of how we shift everything about our social and economic relationships.
Thank you for that articulation. just hearing you say that to me is like a soothing, I just need to hear that more, even though I have a knowingness, right? And
Right.
so how close are we to that being more of a common or accepted narrative, or a narrative that has more momentum behind it, more power?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Sometimes I'm tempted to say we're closer than we were, or sometimes I'm tempted to say we're so incredibly far away. And really, I like the metaphor that a friend of mine who writes and thinks about this stuff in an increasingly public way, Adrienne Marie Brown, who's an organizer and a writer and a thinker based in Detroit. She talks about how we're babies at this, right? So it's actually not about. It's like if you were running a 5K, what is that distance to get from the starting place to the ending place? That's a challenging question to ask if it's somebody in a wheelchair who is attempting to do that, cover that distance, somebody walking, covering that distance, somebody sprinting, or a baby who's literally just learned to walk. Right. And we're in the unique position of being the baby who's just gotten out of stationary position to crawling position. And somewhere along the way, we will become mature enough to actually walk. And somewhere along the way, we will be able to walk and have the orientation to be walking in the right direction. And at some point, we will have the ability to maybe do something like sprinting. But it does have this sense of emergence, that it's just not linear how we get there.
Right.
And I say that because, like, when I was involved in something like learning about, and it's funny, I was practicing transformative justice work before many of our movements were familiar with that term, including us. We formed an organization doing this before we had heard of that word. We heard that term like 3 years later.
And you can define that for us also?
I sure can, yeah. And yet here we are, 14, 15 years later, and the Metoo Movement, which itself came out of a hashtag from several years ago, right? So it's like you can't know when there's going to be a quickening. Right. That's not a linear process. We're taught that way in strategic planning and 5-year plans and the ways in which the nonprofit industrial complex itself has colonized our minds, or the military industrial complex, which is where we even get that language from around strategy and making 5-year plans and stuff, where that comes from, as opposed to understanding that, like, actually the way that that natural systems work are more unpredictable and have these different elements, and there's more probably to learn from biology than chemistry around, or physics around how this stuff works.
Right, complex adaptive systems.
Yeah, exactly. And so for transformative justice, I think transformative justice, and there's so many thinkers and organizations who are working on and defining this concept in new and increasingly effective and interesting ways to me. But I think at a base level, the understanding is like that any particular any need for justice, any moment of harm or violence or trauma is also an opportunity not just to address it, not to fall into patterns of retribution or punitive justice, which is just saying, figure out who caused the harm or who's quote unquote guilty, find that person guilty and then punish them in some way. But it actually zooms out to say, what needs to happen here in order for everyone to be healed, and not just to heal and restore us to where we were before, which is what restorative justice tends to do, taking into account not just the person who caused harm, but the people who were harmed or affected or who lost trust or had a diminished relationship with each other or with the person who caused harm. But transformative justice actually says this is an opportunity for us to look at everything about our system, our community, our relationships, our own psychology, and reassess them. And in our process of repairing the relationship, actually transform those fundamentals to move us toward that society that actually reflects our values, that actually is in right relationship with each other and with the planet, right? So transformative justice is a lens and an opportunity toward bringing about a world that is just and sustainable. And that's a big part of why prison abolition has become so central to that framework, of like, it's not just saying, how can we have a world with less people in prison or fewer prisons? It's actually saying, how do we have a world where we can imagine that people who have caused the most egregious type of harm, murder, rape, sexual assault, even gun violence, right? Like very intense things. How can we imagine a world where our solution to that is not a cage for a human being, but one where we're actually looking at, maybe the point isn't to punish a shooter in a mass shooting so much as, can we zoom out and look at what the insidiousness of the NRA, of access to guns, of toxic masculinity, of all the different ways that we, from birth, assign a gender that is mapped onto violence and performance of hate and of aggression and also foreclosed from connection and vulnerability, and that's actually the issue, which isn't to say then nothing needs to happen with this person who caused incredible or even little amounts of harm, depending on what the situation was.
Sure.
But it's a framework that pushes us to actually to grapple with that in both pragmatic and philosophical ways.
I really appreciate that now as a parent, now that I'm a parent, right? Because I'm thinking of, trying to steward my child, and, this is just for me on a very micro scale inside my own family, but like, how do I guide her forward when she's exhibiting behaviors that, are antisocial or counterproductive? To me, this idea of transformative justice is kind of looking at all of humanity in that same, similar to the collective liberation framework you had of like, okay, if people are harming, how do we interact with them that doesn't cause them more harm? Because if we just punish them, then they suffer, their families suffer, and we're really just perpetuating that same violent cycle. But how do we actually steward the solution within our, like you're saying, each moment's an opportunity. Each conflict here is an opportunity to really to create healing and connection, right? That's kind of the theme I see versus separation, punishment.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, it totally is. And what's interesting for me is that metaphor that I shared of being babies at this is so much. We are not even crawling yet with regards to transformative justice. It's helpful. Like we're still at the philosophical, we're still having the philosophical battle where it's not even like we're aligned that humans shouldn't have cages, that retribution and punishment is not a framework that moves us forward, that heals people. Like we're not even there yet. And those of us who have been beginning to practice this stuff, we're not even at a place where we have a societal level vision for what that looks like. Like having worked on this stuff, what I could say now is there are ways to popularize and practice this skill. And I'm interested in that because we still need more people practicing this in order to begin envisioning what this looks like as a society, at a societal level. Like we're nowhere near figuring out what it looks like for every problem in our society to be dealt with using the kinds of things that we've like barely begun experimenting with in every instance of that. We're just nowhere near that. I mean, the extent to which we can't even get our act together in like woke progressive communities around disability justice, around accessibility, let alone disability justice, like that we have that far to go with people who have not done anything malicious. Like we have so much work to do around what it looks like to get comfortable and get cozy with this approach of something other than exile, other than, ooh, I don't like it. Ooh, it doesn't fit into what we already have going on. So let's push it away. Let's chase someone problematic out of the organization or out of town. Let's construct institutions like an asylum or a penitentiary to silo people away and remove them from society. We still haven't figured that stuff out. So that's the bad news. The good news is that around more of these economic pieces, I think we've made much more progress. We have many more people in the experimentation. some of these projects and some of the leaders have been doing this stuff for many, many decades at this point. And so we're getting to a place where there's some useful lessons on the other side of, hey, we want more worker-owned cooperative businesses. That's great. We want ones that are bigger. We want ones that have regular sales. Great, great, great. Okay. So now that we figured that out, what does it look like to peer under the hood of some of the businesses, even in a US context, that have been around, that have, 50 or 150 or 200 workers and have been operating since the 70s or 80s or 90s? Because guess what? They had what most movements are saying is the win or the demand. They got that 25, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And they're not liberated, right? So like those are important lessons around like, oh, it still means we need these skills around conflict resolution, around how do you engage people who have been socialized to feel alienated from their workplace? People who were hired from their last job and they get hired into this awesome woke job and it's still a job to them because they're not a founder. They're not the first generation who was so excited to create this taxi company or this bakery or whatever it is. And so what do you do around that? There's all this cultural work. There's like leadership work. Right? And so that's the kind of stuff that we're still figuring out. And that's only at this tiny level of just the enterprise. What happens when you start putting those pieces together in like a fractal orientation to think at the scale of an economy? And it's not enough to have tens of thousands of worker cooperatives. That's not quite like all those different ingredients isn't enough to coalesce into the fundamental transformation. You can't just take a bowl and throw flour and milk and sugar in it and suddenly have cake. There's like other stuff that needs to happen. There's chemistry. There's sticking it in the oven, mixing it for a certain amount of time, right? Calibrating the temperature. And so those are the conversations. That's now the horizon on the more philosophical debate, visionary space that I think are critical to have. And it's so important that it's not just practitioners who understand a lot about what it's like inside those workplaces. And it's why we need to be intertwined with actual movements, with movement leadership, with movement philosophy. We need to be accountable to those communities because it's only by coming together. We need each other in order to figure this stuff out. So that's what I think that when we talk about the solidarity economy or what's on the other side of some version of democratic socialism or whatever kinds of languages people are using, a more participatory type of socialism where we have a whole ton in common and there's a robust private economy that isn't individualized and private, but actually collective and private. Not to say collective in the sense of like flat volunteer collectives, right? But that there could be large businesses, there could be multinational organizations that are cooperativized, that there are ways to imagine like the critiques of Amazon that are happening right now. It's not about, well, let's just abolish Amazon, but Sarah Jaffe just wrote a piece about nationalizing Amazon. And then a friend of mine who does a lot of economic justice organizing said, well, actually, I don't think nationalizing it's enough. I think that we need to have worker cooperatives embedded in all of the different tiers of logistics involved in Amazon. Like, what would it look like for the warehouse to be a cooperative, for the delivery services to be another separate syndicate as a cooperative, right? And for that to be enmeshed in a large nationalized or multinational system that's bigger than national borders and goes beyond the politics of various different countries and their cultural or economic crises. So those are the kinds of things that help us push our vision, even to the extent that it helps us scale down and think, okay, if we can envision that way philosophically, then maybe practically we could look at the level of the county or the city or the neighborhood, and what that teaches us about economic relationships and how things are structured, whether from a labor standpoint of what kind of workers are there, how are they treated, how are they embedded in community, and also at the enterprise level, how are businesses integrated into value chain, how are they connected to one another.
Wow. Well, Esteban, I knew this was going to be a rich discussion, and thank you. I'm curious as we move to close. I appreciate the perspective of where we're at in our collective evolution.
Yeah.
And I don't know, do you have some maybe words of advice of how do you maintain hope and inspiration when you can get overwhelmed looking at the state of things, of how well things aren't going for everybody and how far
Right.
we have to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
keeps you going.
what keeps me going is balancing my aware. We're so aware of the problem and the fight and the resistance that's necessary. We're so in touch with it because it's actually happening, right? These are pain points. But in the same way that we're not aware when we are growing and our cells are building and dividing and reproducing proteins, or in the same way that when we're sick and getting better, that we're not fully aware with the generative work of healing.
Yeah.
Our movements are so much less in touch with the work of building. And so what keeps me motivated is it's really easy for me to be overwhelmingly involved and have most of my work be in this hopeful and generative space around doing the constructive work of building our new economy, building new societies, building new ways and practicing and teaching new ways of being. Because there's not a lot of us there right now. And I recognize that I, as an individual, am quite imbalanced. I'm not super duper involved beyond what a typical person does in resistance work, because 98% of our movements are involved in resistance work. And so individually, I'm like, great, I'm going to be 98% involved in the building work and the transformation work, and 2% involved in resistance work and in allyship and solidarity with those movements. But that for me makes it really easy to stay in a space that's hopeful. Like every day when I wake up, I'm like, I'm doing something that's getting us, 10 hours further into, or really I should have a more balanced work day, 7 hours further into building the new, right? Or building new relationships, or just learning, even if it's going through something that's like, that feels like a setback, like having a conflict or some of the stuff that just comes up in organizing, that even that is something to learn from, and that's something that's progressive and gets us somewhere. So that to me keeps us hopeful, and knowing that the path forward is not linear, that the crisis, the economic crisis of 2008 was devastating, and it was a crisis, and it created this incredible opening where in part from that crisis itself, but also moments like Occupy Wall Street that emerged afterwards, that ended up creating the means through which millions of people who were not in any way paying attention to or caring about things like worker cooperatives, solidarity economy that I had already spent like a decade working on, were suddenly tuned in and saying, hey, come on my podcast and tell us more about this. Come lead a workshop. Come, share, write more things down. Bring us to your national conference. We want our movements to be interlaced and learning from you. Or just last month, the Movement for Black Lives invited a bunch of us who are, I guess, Black organizers or leaders involved in worker cooperative and solidarity economy organizing to join them as advisors in informing their economic platform and their vision for Black lives. Those are kinds of things where we could have spent another 50 years battling to further those conversations. So crisis creates openings as well. It doesn't minimize the impact and the pain of the crisis. We need to double down and be there for people. And it's nice over here. We need more people involved in this generative work.
Right. So staying in the solutions, right?
That's how we get free,
Beautiful. Well, Esteban, how can we help you? Is there anything you need, or the listeners? Is there anything that people can do to support your work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think staying in touch and staying aware of what these moments are, what these opportunities are that pop up. So just following us on social media, checking in on our updates, whether you're subscribing to our newsletter or just checking out our website, usworker.coop. We have information and stories about what it's like for immigrant worker owners, what it's like for Black people who are organizing new worker co-ops, what it's like for returning citizens getting out of the carceral system and experiencing and entering the workforce through worker ownership. And then, of course, we always need resources. That could be hiring us or our members to work with you, as some of our members do interpretation, facilitation. We do a lot of education and training ourselves. That's a great resource. if you have a need, we can match that with technical assistance or some of our own skills. And then finally, something that's accessible for anyone to do is to become a sustainer of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-op. And you can do that on a monthly basis by just joining once and signing up with a card and making a recurring donation, or you can also just make a one-time donation through our website. So that's all at usworker.coop. And we've got stuff on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram even, which is even probably the best place to follow some of the stories and images of like who is involved in these movements, and just to signal boost that.
Great, thanks. Just so appreciative, Esteban. Any final thoughts to share with our listeners?
Final thoughts. I think it's both slowing down and staying out of that anxiety mode, but also leveling up our thought and our engagement toward your last point of what's generative and hopeful. How do we move into conflict in a way that's slower, with less ferocity and more warmth and generosity and compassion, which of course sounds like hippie gobbledygook. But when you start practicing it, you notice there's like some real materialist stuff there. And I think that's a big part of how we get free. It's not all some glorious, national electoral campaign. So there's opportunities everywhere for how things move forward. There's definitely local groups to plug into, local networks. We have local networks all around the country, local policy initiatives. So find your people, find what feels good, find your tribe, and keep engaged in work that is really moving toward getting us free.
Wow. Love this. The slow down, step up. Beautiful. Thanks so much, Esteban.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me on here.
That concludes this episode of Next Economy Now, and now on to our mini interview with Doug Bistry, CEO of Clearinghouse Cdfi.
Okay, welcome, Doug, to this interview series, the Next Economy Now podcast. And for listeners, I think one of the reasons I'm excited about Clearinghouse Cdfi is that you're a lot different than other financial institutions. And what about, this is a unique opportunity to talk to, I feel like, a lender, when I'm not actually seeking a loan, but do you have any tips for people? Maybe I'm a business person, maybe I'm the CEO, and I'm actually interested in getting a loan from Clearinghouse or another. What sort of tips or advice do you have for actually from the bank or not the bank, the lender's perspective of what do you recommend that CEOs do? What are some of the biggest oversights that they make that you could help, if you could talk to them and say, hey, just do this and you'll have a better chance?
Yeah, Ryan, that's a really good question, and I appreciate you asking it. Well, one of the things is any loan that anyone applies for, whether it's to a CDFI or a bank or a credit union, there is just a lot of paperwork. It is a paper chase, and you are going to be asked for a lot of information. And that's the way the underwriters I tell my underwriters, I said, you guys are detectives. Your job is to find out everything you can about this business, this borrower. You need to find out good, bad, or indifferent information, and you need to put it together, and that's going to help us make a credit decision. So when we get a borrower that says, we say, hey, here's a list of what you need to get us. And it might be, tax returns and financial projections and, a list of your current employees and, marketing material, et cetera, tax returns, you name it. And part of it comes in, we get a little bit at a time. That's not a good sign. I think there's a high correlation between people that can't get you the information you ask for in a loan application and people who will have a hard time making a payment. So what I like when somebody comes to us and says, hey, Clearinghouse CDFI, we need a loan. And we say, all right, here's the stuff you need to give us. And guess what? We get a package back and everything's there. Why? That's number one, you've made the underwriter's job a lot easier. Number two, you've told us that you're serious and you have the ability to organize and manage things. And I'll tell you, a lot of small businesses fail because they are doing too much and they're over their heads. So that's one thing, Ryan. I think the other thing that I always find interesting is, people will say, Doug, can I meet with you? I want to talk to you about my new project. And, I always try to take meetings and return phone calls. That's part of my personal, sometimes it's a challenge, but I try to. And I'll meet with someone and they'll spend 20 minutes showing me pictures of their building and how they're going to do it and how great it's going to be and where the window is going to be and where the counter is and that. And it really doesn't matter if the numbers don't add up. And so I often tell, folks is that, I trust that your building is going to look pretty, your plan's great, but let's really look at your numbers. How much revenue are you going to have coming in? What are your expenses? Have you provided for paying taxes and all the other expenses? And let's really focus on your numbers because that's ultimately what's going to drive it. Now, we might all fall in love with a project, and we always want to know that, but it's going to really come down to, often the numbers. And I think sometimes borrowers make the mistake of falling in love with their idea and not spending enough time looking at their numbers.
I would second that. So it sounds like it all started, you got to be a profitable business to even have a chance, or not profitable, sorry. You have to be a somewhat organized financially to even have a chance at a loan. And then there are some extras that you look for, but if the numbers are not there or they're a mess, then it's sort of a non-starter. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we have loans in our pipeline that we think are good and we really like and we would do. We can't get the borrowers to get us basic information and it ends up falling out of the pipeline. And, sometimes the borrower will come back and say, well, hey, how come you guys didn't do my loan? I can't believe Clearinghouse didn't do my loan. It's like, no, you didn't do your loan because you didn't get us what we asked for. And, that doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen sometimes. So it is just really important to be organized and get all the information in that you can. And the other thing is, if you've got something that's bad, don't try to hide it. If you had a bankruptcy 3 years ago, don't not mention it. We're going to find out, and it's going to look worse. So, you want to just disclose everything. And if you had a business, 5 years ago that completely failed, no sense in not talking about it. Maybe you learned a lot of lessons from it. We would rather have someone be upfront, tell us about that, and in that way we have developed a relationship of trust early on in the underwriting process.
And where can folks learn more about Clearinghouse and, say if there's any investors who are interested, what's the best way for them to get in contact?
We have a great website that has a ton of information, including our financials. It is www.cdfi.com. Again, that's ccdfi.com. And a lot of information there. There's contact numbers. I'd be happy to talk to anybody that is serious about investing or working with us. And also, we're looking for projects to lend, good projects. And so in our service areas, California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and all of Indian country throughout the United States. So if anyone is aware of an unmet credit need that has good community impact, or, often our loans are made to entrepreneurs, people of color, or members of groups that have been disenfranchised. And if anyone is aware of loans, boy, we'd love to hear from them as well.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.